The cruelest thing about fate is that it sometimes lets you find the right person at exactly the wrong time. The rain had been falling for 3 straight hours when I stood in front of Claire Bennett's grave. Cold November rain. The kind that soaked through a wool coat and settled deep into your bones. The cemetery sat on a hill overlooking the Hudson River, where gray water blended into a gray sky until the horizon disappeared completely. Fitting, I thought. Everything in my life had looked the same since the day I lost her. Colorless, endless, empty. Water dripped from the black umbrella one of my security men held over my head, but I barely noticed. My eyes remained fixed on the marble headstone in front of me. Claire Bennett, beloved daughter, beloved friend, beloved everything. 28 years old. Gone far too soon. The dates carved beneath her name blurred as rain mixed with something else burning behind my eyes. 18 months. 18 months since I had stood in this exact spot and watched them lower her casket into the ground. 18 months since I had listened to people talk about acceptance and healing and moving forward. 18 months since I had discovered that no amount of power could bargain with loss. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a single white rose. It was ridiculous, really. A man like me carrying flowers every Sunday morning. If anyone had told me 5 years ago that Ethan Moretti would spend his weekends visiting a grave instead of running his empire, I would have laughed in their face. But Claire had changed many things about me. Even after she was gone, kneeling carefully on the wet grass, I placed the rose beside dozens of others already resting there. Fresh flowers. Every week. Without fail. Winter storms. Summer heat. Holidays. Birthdays. It didn't matter. I always came back. Because leaving felt impossible. I'm sorry, I whispered. My voice sounded strange against the steady rhythm of the rain. Smaller somehow. Human. I should have chosen you sooner. The words hung in the cold air between us. Words I had repeated 1,000 times. Maybe 10,000. They never hurt less. If anything, they hurt more each time because I knew exactly where I had gone wrong. I had spent years believing I could balance 2 worlds. The world I inherited. The world she deserved. I had convinced myself there would always be time to fix things later. Time to walk away. Time to choose her. Time to become the man she saw when everyone else only saw a powerful last name. But time had its own plans. Thunder rolled softly across the river. Somewhere behind me, I heard the distant sound of footsteps approaching through the wet grass. One of my men, probably. Another meeting. Another problem waiting for my signature. Another reminder that the city still expected me to rule it even though part of me had stopped living 18 months ago. I stood slowly and adjusted my coat. I miss you every day, Claire. The confession escaped before I could stop it. My throat tightened. And somehow that's still not the worst part. Because the worst part wasn't losing her. The worst part was realizing she had been right all along. Love wasn't something you postponed until life became convenient. Love was the thing that made life matter in the first place. I stared at the headstone one final time before turning away. The rain continued to fall. The river continued to move. The world continued pretending everything was normal. And beneath 6 feet of earth, the woman I loved remained silent. At least that's what I believed. Because 300 miles away, in a small coastal town where nobody knew the name Ethan Moretti, Claire Bennett opened the front door of a white cottage and smiled as a little girl ran into her arms. The first time I saw Claire Bennett, she was standing in the middle of a thunderstorm arguing with a parking meter. 18 months earlier. Long before graves and regrets and white roses. Long before she became the reason I questioned every choice I had ever made. Rain hammered against the windshield of my black SUV as it crawled through downtown Manhattan traffic. It was nearly 7 o'clock, and the city glowed beneath a curtain of water and neon reflections. Most people were rushing home. I was heading to another meeting I did not want to attend. My driver kept one hand on the wheel while the windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the storm. Through the tinted glass, the world looked distant and blurred. Then I noticed her. She stood alone on the corner outside a small community arts center. No umbrella, no coat, just a soaked blue sweater and a determination that somehow managed to overpower the weather. She was feeding quarters into a broken parking meter while talking to it under her breath. I could not hear the words, but I could see the frustration written across her face. The meter flashed red again. She threw her hands into the air. Then she laughed. Actually laughed. Most people cursed when life made things difficult. She laughed. Something about that caught my attention. Maybe because I had forgotten how. The traffic light turned red, forcing us to stop directly across from her. She brushed wet strands of blonde hair from her face and looked toward the street. For one brief second, her green eyes met mine through the glass. She could not have known who I was. Most ordinary people did not. But she looked directly at me anyway, without fear, without curiosity, without the cautious respect people usually displayed when they recognized power. Just a quick glance, human to human. Then she smiled. Not at me, at herself, as if she had just remembered something funny. The light turned green. The moment should have ended there. It almost did. Then I saw a stack of papers slip from her arms. The wind caught them instantly. White pages scattered across the sidewalk like birds taking flight. Claire groaned and ran after them. One page landed in a puddle. Another slid beneath a parked car. Before I understood what I was doing, I opened the SUV door and stepped into the rain. My security detail exchanged confused looks, but followed. I ignored them. Water soaked my coat within seconds as I crossed the street. Claire was kneeling beside the curb, trying to rescue a waterlogged sheet of paper when a shadow fell over her. She looked up. Surprise flashed across her face. I picked up one of the pages and handed it to her. It was covered in colorful sketches, children's drawings, crayons, paint, hope. Thank you, she said, accepting it carefully. Her voice was warm despite the weather. I was beginning to think the universe had declared war on me. I glanced at the stubborn parking meter. Looks like the universe started with that machine. She laughed again. A real laugh, bright enough to cut through the storm. And for the first time in years, I found myself smiling back. After that night, I should have forgotten her. That was how my world worked. Meetings replaced memories. Deadlines buried distractions. Faces appeared and disappeared every day. But Claire Bennett refused to disappear. 3 days later, I found myself standing outside the same community arts center at 6:15 in the evening, staring through rain-speckled windows like a man who had lost his mind. Children filled the room inside. Some painted at easels. Others sat around folding tables covered with markers and colored paper. In the center of it all stood Claire. She moved from child to child with endless patience, kneeling beside one little girl to help with a drawing before crossing the room to encourage a boy struggling with a paintbrush. The entire place seemed brighter around her. I hated how much I noticed that. My phone buzzed. A reminder about an investment meeting scheduled in 20 minutes. I silenced it without looking away from the window. Then Claire glanced toward the street and spotted me. Her eyebrows lifted in surprise. A moment later, she pushed open the front door and stepped outside. The evening air smelled like rain and wet pavement. "Let me guess," she said, folding her arms. "You have developed a sudden interest in children's finger painting." I almost laughed. Almost. I was nearby. "That is a terrible lie." Her smile widened. "You should work on those." I looked at her for a second. Most people measured every word around me. Claire challenged them. "Maybe I need a better teacher." "Maybe you do." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Traffic rolled past behind us. A city bus hissed to a stop across the street. Somewhere above, thunder rumbled through low clouds. Normal sounds. Ordinary sounds. The kind of life I rarely paid attention to. "What exactly do you do?" she asked. There it was. The question everyone eventually asked. Usually they wanted numbers. Titles. Influence. Something they could admire or fear. Claire sounded genuinely curious. "Business." She groaned dramatically. "That is the most suspicious answer possible." "It happens to be true." "So you are either incredibly boring or secretly interesting. Which one do you think?" She tilted her head as if considering it seriously. "Definitely secretly interesting." I shook my head. "You reached that conclusion awfully fast. You stepped into a thunderstorm to rescue children's artwork." Her green eyes sparkled. "That tells me more than a job title ever could." The strange thing was that I wanted her to be right. I wanted to be the version of myself she imagined standing there. Not the man buried beneath responsibilities and expectations. Just Ethan. The conversation lasted 10 minutes. Maybe 15. Long enough for me to learn she taught community art classes 3 evenings a week. Long enough to discover she drank too much coffee and forgot where she parked her car at least twice a month. Long enough for something unfamiliar to settle quietly inside my chest. When her phone chimed, she glanced at the screen and sighed. "I promised my sister I would call her." I nodded. "Then I should let you go." Claire smiled. Softly this time. I am glad your mysterious business schedule allowed time for children's artwork today. Before I could respond, she turned and headed back toward the building. Halfway to the door, she stopped and looked over her shoulder. See you around, Ethan. Then she disappeared inside. I stood there far longer than necessary, staring at a closed door while rain began falling again. And for the first time in years, I found myself hoping she was right about that. Some people change your life with grand gestures. Claire changed mine by making ordinary moments feel important. Over the next several weeks, seeing her became the part of my day I looked forward to most. Sometimes it was 10 minutes outside the arts center. Sometimes it was coffee from a small corner cafe she insisted served the best coffee in Manhattan. It did not. But I never argued because listening to her defend it was more entertaining than winning. One Saturday afternoon, she convinced me to visit a street art festival in Brooklyn. I arrived expecting noise, crowds, and 100 reasons to leave early. Instead, I found myself walking beside her beneath strings of lights stretched between old brick buildings while local artists displayed paintings and sculptures along the sidewalks. Claire stopped at every booth. She spoke to artists, asked questions, complimented details most people would never notice. The entire neighborhood seemed to know her. How do you know so many people? I finally asked. She laughed and accepted a paper cup of lemonade from a vendor who greeted her by name. I pay attention. That is your secret? Most people want to be noticed, Ethan. They remember the people who notice them. I thought about that longer than I should have. Because she was right. People spent years trying to impress me. Very few actually saw me. Claire did. Somehow she always did. A few hours later, we ended up sitting on a bench overlooking the East River. The sun was beginning to set. Orange light reflected across the water while ferries moved slowly through the harbor. Around us, the city buzzed with life. Car horns, music, laughter drifting from rooftop restaurants. Claire sat with her knees pulled slightly toward her chest, watching the skyline. What are you thinking about? I asked. How strange life is. Her voice softened. 1 year ago, I thought I had everything figured out. Then none of my plans worked. I glanced toward her. And now? She smiled. Now I think life might know things I do not. The answer stayed with me. Because I had spent my entire life controlling outcomes. Managing risks, anticipating problems before they appeared. Yet somehow the best thing that had happened to me recently was something I never planned. A breeze moved across the river. Claire shivered slightly. Without thinking, I draped my coat over her shoulders. She looked surprised. You are going to freeze. I will survive. Her fingers tightened around the fabric. Then she looked at me with an expression I could not quite understand. Something warm, something careful. Something dangerous in the most beautiful way possible. For a few seconds neither of us spoke. The city seemed quieter. The distance between us suddenly felt much smaller than it had a moment ago. Then her phone rang. The spell broke instantly. Claire glanced at the screen and sighed. My sister. She answered while standing from the bench. A minute later she returned, apologetic. Family emergency. Nothing serious. I need to go. I nodded, even though disappointment settled heavily inside my chest. Claire smiled softly. You know, when I first met you, I thought you were intimidating. And now? Her eyes sparkled beneath the fading sunset. Now I think you spend way too much time pretending not to care about things. Before I could respond, she leaned forward and kissed my cheek. Quick, gentle, unexpected. Then she walked away toward the street, while my heart forgot every rule it had ever followed. The first warning arrived 3 days later. Not from an enemy, not from a rival, from my own family. The Moretti estate sat 30 miles outside Manhattan, hidden behind iron gates and old money. The mansion had belonged to my grandfather before it belonged to my father, and one day it was supposed to belong to me. Every stone in that place carried expectations. Every hallway reminded me of obligations I had been taught since childhood. That evening, rain tapped softly against the tall windows of my father's study while a fire crackled in the marble fireplace. Across from me, Vincent Moretti sat behind an antique oak desk, his silver hair reflecting the warm light. At 65, my father still possessed the kind of presence that filled a room without effort. He studied me quietly before speaking. You have been distracted. I leaned back in my chair. That is your concern? Everything concerning you is my concern. His voice remained calm. Controlled. Dangerous in a way only family could be. I knew where this conversation was heading before he said her name. Claire Bennett. The sound of her name inside those walls felt wrong somehow, like sunlight trapped inside a storm. My expression never changed, but something inside me tightened. You have been investigating me. I have been protecting this family. He folded his hands together. There is a difference. I almost laughed. There was always a difference when powerful men explain their actions. She is a teacher, he continued. A good woman from everything I have been told. I said nothing, which is exactly why this needs to end. Silence settled between us. Heavy, familiar. My father stood and walked toward the window overlooking the estate grounds. You know what is expected of you. I know what you expect. He turned slowly. This is larger than either of us. The future of our family cannot be built on emotions. The words landed harder than they should have, because part of me had spent weeks pretending this moment would never come. Pretending Claire existed outside the reach of my world. Pretending happiness could remain simple. You have not even met her. I do not need to. His voice sharpened slightly. She does not belong in this life. I looked toward the rain streaking the glass. The strange thing was that he was right. Claire did not belong in my world. She belonged in bright classrooms filled with paint and laughter. She belonged at street festivals and coffee shops and ordinary afternoons. She belonged everywhere my world could never go. Yet somehow she had become the only place that felt like home. You will stop seeing her. It was not a request. I stood slowly. No. For the first time that evening, genuine surprise crossed my father's face. Then disappointment followed. You are thinking like a man in love. Maybe. The admission hung between us. Raw, honest, unavoidable. Then let me give you advice. His eyes hardened. Love fades. Responsibility does not. I walked toward the door. My hand paused on the brass handle. That might be true. I glanced back at him. But responsibility has never made me smile the way she does. Then I left the study. Outside, the rain continued falling across the estate. Miles away, Claire was probably finishing one of her art classes, completely unaware that a battle had just begun. And for the first time in my life, I was not afraid of disappointing my family. I was afraid of losing her. The problem with secrets is that they never stay buried. 2 weeks after my conversation with my father, Claire discovered that much on her own. It happened on a Thursday evening. The city was wrapped in early winter darkness, and a cold wind chased people off the sidewalks long before sunset. Claire and I sat inside a small diner near Central Park, sharing fries while arguing about whether pineapple belonged on pizza. It was the kind of ordinary conversation I had come to treasure. The kind that made me forget everything waiting outside those walls. Claire was laughing when her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and frowned. That is strange. What is? Someone left a message at the arts center. She looked confused. No name. No number. A small knot tightened in my chest. What did it say? She hesitated. It said I should be careful about who I spend time with. The fries suddenly tasted like cardboard. Probably a prank. She studied my face. You do not believe that. I forced a smile. People say strange things. She nodded slowly, but I could tell she was not convinced. Neither was I. The rest of dinner passed normally on the surface. We talked about her students. I listened to a story about a 6-year-old who painted an entire dinosaur family purple because he claimed green was boring. Claire laughed while telling it. I laughed too, but part of my attention remained trapped inside that message. The next morning, things became worse. Claire called me before 8 o'clock. Her voice sounded different. Quieter. Can you meet me? 20 minutes later, I found her sitting on a bench near the river. The sky hung low and gray above the water. She looked exhausted. A folded envelope rested in her hands. This was taped to my apartment door. My stomach dropped. She handed it to me. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No signature. No threat. Just one sentence. Some worlds are not meant to mix. For several seconds I stared at the words. Then I folded the paper and slipped it back into the envelope. Claire watched me carefully. Who are you really, Ethan? There it was. The question I had spent weeks avoiding. Not because I wanted to lie to her. Because I knew the truth would change everything. Cold air moved across the river. People passed behind us. A jogger. A woman walking her dog. Ordinary lives continuing while mine quietly came apart. Claire. My voice sounded rough. There are things about my family that are complicated. Complicated how? I looked down at my hands. For the first time in years, I did not have the right answer. The kind of complicated that follows people. Silence stretched between us. Painfully long. Finally Claire stood. Her eyes glistened with disappointment more than fear. Somehow that hurt worse. I care about you, Ethan. The words came out softly. Maybe more than I should. My heart stumbled. Claire. She shook her head. But I cannot be part of something I do not understand. The wind caught a strand of blonde hair and pushed it across her face. She brushed it away and managed a small smile that broke me completely. I need time. Then she turned and walked away along the river. I remained on that bench long after she disappeared from sight, watching gray water roll past beneath a gray sky. Knowing that for the first time since I met her, I had absolutely no idea how to fix what was coming next. The longest week of my life began with silence. Claire did not answer my calls. She did not reply to my messages. Every morning, I found myself reaching for my phone before my eyes were fully open, hoping to see her name on the screen. Every night, I went to sleep disappointed. Work became unbearable. Meetings blurred together. Conversations sounded distant. Numbers and reports and contracts that once held my complete attention suddenly felt meaningless. The only thing I could think about was the look in Claire's eyes when she walked away from me by the river. Disappointment. Hurt. Doubt. 3 days later, I drove past the arts center. Not because I planned to stop. At least that was the lie I told myself. The building stood quiet beneath a pale winter sky. Children's artwork still decorated the windows. Bright colors against gray concrete. Hope against reality. I sat inside my SUV across the street for nearly 20 minutes before finally leaving. Cowardice disguised as patience. By Friday evening, I had reached my limit. The Moretti estate felt suffocating. Every hallway reminded me of expectations. Every conversation reminded me of obligations. Every glance from my father felt like a silent reminder that he believed time would solve this problem for him. He was wrong. I found him in the library shortly after sunset. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves surrounded him while a fire crackled softly nearby. He looked up from a document as I entered. You seem troubled. I laughed without humor. You know exactly why. He placed the papers aside. Then perhaps you should listen to reason. Reason? My voice sharpened. Someone sent anonymous messages to Claire. His expression remained calm. Too calm. And someone clearly wanted her scared. Silence. Heavy. Deliberate. My father stood slowly. Fear has a way of revealing difficult truths. The answer hit me like ice water. You knew? I knew people were concerned. For a moment, I simply stared at him. This man had taught me loyalty, discipline, honor. Yet somehow he had convinced himself that hurting an innocent woman was acceptable if it protected tradition. She has done nothing wrong. Her mistake was meeting you. The words echoed through the room. I felt something inside me break. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, like a rope stretched too tight for too long. No. My father frowned. No. Her mistake was believing people could be better than they are. For the first time, anger flashed behind his eyes. Be careful, Ethan. Why? I stepped forward. Because I disagree with you? The fire crackled between us. Shadows danced across the walls. You are risking everything for one woman. His voice hardened. Then maybe everything was not worth as much as I thought. The silence that followed seemed endless. Finally, I turned toward the door. If your world requires Claire to disappear from my life, then maybe it is not a world I want anymore. Behind me, I heard my father say my name. I kept walking. Outside, cold air filled my lungs. For the first time in weeks, I felt clarity instead of confusion. I pulled out my phone and looked at Claire's contact information. My thumb hovered over the screen. Then I pressed call. It rang once, twice, 3 times. Just before voicemail answered, I heard her voice. Soft, careful, uncertain. Hello, Ethan. And suddenly hope returned. Hope is a dangerous thing when you have almost lost it. The moment I heard Claire's voice, every argument I had rehearsed disappeared. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. I stood beneath the cold night sky outside the estate, while my heart pounded harder than it had during any business negotiation in my life. Claire. Her name left my mouth like a prayer. I heard her take a slow breath. You sound tired. I laughed softly. That is because I have been an idiot. Silence. Then a small sound that might have been a laugh. The first one I had heard from her in over a week. You are not supposed to agree that quickly, I said. You made it very difficult. Her voice carried warmth again, but sadness lingered beneath it. We talked for nearly an hour. Not about my family. Not about the messages. Not about fear. We talked about ordinary things. Her students. My inability to remember movie titles. The coffee shop that had accidentally served her hot chocolate instead of coffee that morning. Small things. Beautiful things. The kind of conversation that reminded me why losing her felt impossible. 3 days later, she agreed to meet me. Snow drifted gently across Manhattan that afternoon, turning sidewalks white and softening the edges of the city. Claire chose a bookstore near Bryant Park. The moment I walked inside and saw her standing between tall wooden shelves, something inside me settled. She wore a cream-colored coat and held a paperback novel against her chest. Familiar. Comfortable. Home. Hi, she said. Hi. Neither of us seemed to know what came next. Then she smiled, and everything became easier. We spent hours wandering through the bookstore. Claire recommended novels. I pretended to understand literary discussions I was completely unqualified to participate in. She caught me pretending almost immediately. You have not read this, have you? She asked, holding up a famous classic. Of course I have. Ethan. I sighed. The cover is nice. Her laughter echoed between the shelves. Other customers glanced toward us. I did not care. Later that evening, we found a quiet table inside a nearby cafe. Snow continued falling outside the windows while soft music played overhead. For the first time since our argument by the river, the distance between us felt gone. Then Claire reached into her purse. There is something I want to show you. She placed an old photograph on the table. The picture looked worn with age. Two young men stood beside a fishing boat at a harbor. One of them looked vaguely familiar. My stomach tightened. Claire pointed toward the man on the left. That is my father. Then she pointed toward the second man. My pulse stopped. Even 30 years younger, I recognized him instantly. Vincent Moretti. My father. Claire looked at me carefully. I found this while cleaning my mother's attic last weekend. Snow drifted quietly outside while the world tilted beneath my feet. Claire, I whispered. Where did your father know mine from? Her green eyes searched mine. That is exactly what I was hoping you could tell me. For a moment, I could not breathe. The photograph rested between us on the cafe table, while snow drifted beyond the windows, and people carried on with their evenings completely unaware that my world had just shifted again. Claire watched me carefully. You recognize him? It was not a question. I nodded slowly. That is my father. Her eyes widened. Then they really knew each other. I picked up the photograph. My father looked younger, happier somehow, standing beside a man I had never seen before, but who shared Claire's eyes. The same kindness, the same warmth. My father never mentioned him, I said quietly. Neither did mine. Claire wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. After I found the picture, I asked my mother about it. What did she say? Claire hesitated. Not much. Just that my father and yours were close friends when they were young. Friends. The word felt impossible. I thought about every conversation I had ever had with Vincent Moretti. Every warning. Every argument. Every reason he had given for keeping Claire away from me. None of it made sense anymore. If our families had once been connected, why had he never told me? Why had he fought so hard to separate us? The questions followed me all night. The next morning, I drove to the estate before sunrise. Frost covered the grounds. The sky remained dark blue, caught somewhere between night and morning. I found my father sitting alone in the breakfast room with a cup of coffee and a newspaper. He looked up when I entered. Then he saw the photograph in my hand. The color drained from his face. Not much. Just enough. Where did you get that? He asked. I placed it on the table. Claire. Silence. My father stared at the image for several long seconds. Something old and painful moved across his expression. You knew her father. He closed the newspaper, folded it carefully, deliberately, buying time. His name was Daniel Bennett. And my voice sharpened. And he was my friend. The answer stunned me. Not because of what he said, because of how he said it. Regret filled every word. Then why have you spent months trying to keep Claire away from me? My father looked out the window toward the frozen gardens. Because I made a promise. I frowned. What kind of promise? He remained silent for so long that I thought he would refuse to answer. Then he finally spoke. 30 years ago, Daniel saved my life. I stared at him. Saved your life? He nodded slowly. And before he died, he made me promise something. My pulse quickened. What? My father closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, they looked older than I had ever seen them. He made me promise that his family would never be pulled into mine. The room fell silent. Outside, the first rays of sunlight touched the snow-covered lawn. Inside, I felt as if I had just discovered the first piece of a puzzle neither Claire nor I understood. Then my father's phone vibrated on the table. He glanced at the screen. His expression changed instantly. Concern. Alarm. Fear. What is it? I asked. He stood abruptly. Claire. My heart stopped. What about Claire? He looked directly at me. She is gone. The world narrowed to 2 words. She is gone. I was already moving before my father finished speaking. The breakfast room disappeared behind me. The estate. The snow. The questions. None of it mattered. Only Claire. My calls went straight to voicemail. Again, and again, and again. By the time I reached Manhattan, a cold panic had settled beneath my ribs. Claire was not the type of person who vanished without telling someone. She called her mother every Sunday. She checked on her sister almost daily. She left notes, sent messages, remembered birthdays. She did not simply disappear. I parked outside her apartment building and took the stairs 2 at a time. Her door remained locked. No answer. No sound inside. The elderly woman across the hall opened her door slightly when she saw me. Are you looking for Claire? Hope flared instantly. Yes. The woman frowned. She left yesterday morning. Did she say where she was going? No. My heart sank. Was she alone? The woman hesitated. I think so. She looked upset, though. Upset. The word echoed inside my head all afternoon. By evening, I found myself sitting alone inside the small cafe where Claire and I had spent countless hours talking. The same corner table remained empty. Outside, snow drifted through the city lights. Inside, everything felt wrong. Then my phone rang. Claire's mother. I answered immediately. Mrs. Bennett. Her voice sounded strained. Ethan. Silence followed. Nervous. Careful. Have you heard from her? No. I closed my eyes. Have you? She came by yesterday. My pulse quickened. What did she say? Another pause. She told me she needed to leave for a while. The words hit harder than I expected. Leave. Not disappear. Leave. There was a difference. Did she tell you why? No. Her voice softened. But she was crying. The cafe suddenly felt too small. Too warm. Too crowded. I stepped outside into the cold air. Snowflakes landed on my coat and melted instantly. Mrs. Bennett, if she contacts you, I will tell her you called. I thanked her and ended the call. For a long moment, I stood there beneath the falling snow. Then something occurred to me. Claire had always gone to one place when life overwhelmed her. A small coastal town in Maine where her aunt owned a cottage near the ocean. She had mentioned it once while telling me stories about childhood summers. At the time, it seemed like a random detail. Now it felt important. Very important. Hope returned. Small but real. The next morning, I began driving north. 6 hours. Nearly 300 miles of frozen highways and gray winter skies. The farther I traveled, the quieter the world became. By sunset, I finally reached the coast. The Atlantic stretched endlessly beyond rocky shores. Waves rolled beneath a pale pink sky. And there, at the end of a narrow road lined with snow-covered pines, stood a small white cottage facing the sea. My hands tightened around the steering wheel. Smoke drifted from the chimney. Someone was home. And for the first time in 2 days, I allowed myself to believe that maybe I was not too late. My heart was already racing when I stepped out of the SUV. The ocean air tasted of salt and winter. Waves rolled against the rocky shoreline below the cottage, steady and endless, as if the world had never learned how to stop moving. For a moment, I simply stood there staring at the small white house. Smoke drifted from the chimney. Warm yellow light glowed through the windows. Claire was inside. After 2 days of fear, doubt, and unanswered questions, she was finally within reach. I walked toward the front porch slowly, almost afraid that if I moved too fast the entire scene would disappear. The wooden steps creaked beneath my shoes. A wind chime hanging beside the door stirred softly in the evening breeze. Then I knocked. Silence followed. 1 second. 2. 3. The sound of footsteps reached me from inside. My pulse pounded in my ears. The door opened. Claire stood there wrapped in a cream-colored sweater, her blonde hair falling loosely around her shoulders. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. She looked surprised, then guilty, then relieved. Every emotion crossed her face at once. You found me. Her voice was barely above a whisper. I laughed softly, not because anything was funny, because hearing her voice again felt like breathing after being underwater too long. You disappeared. Her eyes dropped toward the porch floor. I know. Cold air drifted between us. The ocean crashed against distant rocks. Finally, she stepped aside. You should come in. The cottage smelled like cinnamon and coffee. A fire crackled inside a stone fireplace. Books lined shelves along the walls. Family photographs sat on small tables. The entire place felt peaceful in a way my world never had. Claire led me into the living room and sat on the edge of a sofa. I remained standing for a moment before joining her. Neither of us knew where to begin. Finally, she looked at me. I am sorry. I shook my head immediately. Do not apologize. I left without telling you. Because you were scared. Her eyes filled with tears she was trying very hard not to shed. Not for myself. The words caught me off guard. Then for what? Claire looked toward the fire. The orange glow reflected softly across her face. Your father told me the truth. My stomach tightened. What truth? About the promise. She folded her hands together. About my father saving his life. I stared at her. You spoke to him? She nodded. The day before I left. That explained everything and nothing at the same time. Claire. Her green eyes met mine. He loved my father, Ethan. I could see it. And he believes history is repeating itself. History does not get to decide our future. The words came out stronger than I intended. She smiled sadly. That sounds exactly like something you would say. I reached for her hand. This time she did not pull away. I drove 300 miles because I thought I lost you. Her fingers tightened around mine. You did not. The fire crackled softly behind us. Outside, snow began falling across the coastline. And for the first time in days, the distance between us finally started to disappear. The next morning arrived wrapped in silence. Snow covered the coastline in a blanket of white, and the ocean beyond the cottage looked calm enough to hold every secret in the world. I woke before sunrise and found Claire standing on the back porch with a mug of coffee warming her hands. She looked out toward the water while pale golden light slowly emerged along the horizon. For a moment, I simply watched her. The wind lifted strands of her hair. The cold painted her cheeks pink. She looked exactly like the future I had almost lost. Claire sensed me behind her and smiled softly. You always wake up too early. You say that like it is a flaw. It is definitely a flaw. Her smile widened. Normal people sleep. I stepped beside her. Normal people do not disappear and force someone to drive 300 miles through a snowstorm. She laughed quietly and lowered her gaze. The sound warmed something inside me. We stood there together while the sunrise painted the ocean gold. Then Claire handed me a small envelope. My mother mailed this to me yesterday. I frowned. What is it? Something she found after my father died. The paper felt fragile with age. Inside was a handwritten letter. The signature at the bottom stopped my heart instantly. Daniel Bennett, Claire's father. I read every word carefully. The letter had been written more than 25 years earlier. Most of it spoke about family, hope, and gratitude. Then I reached the final paragraph. Daniel wrote about my father. About a promise. About friendship. But one sentence stood apart from everything else. If our families ever find each other again, do not let fear make their choices for them. I read it twice. Then a third time. Claire watched my expression change. I know. Her voice was barely above a whisper. That is why I wanted you to see it. The ocean wind moved between us. Somewhere in the distance a seagull called across the shoreline. For the first time, the pieces finally began fitting together. Daniel Bennett had not wanted separation. He had wanted freedom. Freedom from old mistakes. Freedom from fear. Freedom to choose differently. My father had carried guilt for decades and mistaken it for protection. Claire stepped closer. Ethan, none of this was ever about us. I looked at her. No. She smiled sadly. It was about people trying to keep promises they no longer understood. Later that afternoon, we drove back to New York together. The entire trip felt different. Lighter. As if the road ahead had finally become visible. When we arrived at the estate just before sunset, my father was waiting in the library. The moment he saw the letter, he understood. He read it slowly. Then he sat down without speaking. For a long time, silence filled the room. Finally, he looked at Claire. His eyes glistened with regret. Your father was a better man than I deserved. Claire smiled gently. He considered you his brother. My father lowered his head. Years of guilt seemed to leave him all at once. When he finally looked at me again, the fight was gone from his eyes. I spent decades honoring the wrong part of that promise. The words hung in the room. Heavy, honest, real. Then he stood and walked toward the window overlooking the snow-covered grounds. If Daniel were here today, he said quietly. I think he would tell me to stop standing in your way. And for the first time since Claire entered my life, nobody asked us to choose between love and family. 2 years later, I stood beneath a clear summer sky in a park overlooking the Hudson River and realized how strange life could be. The city shimmered in the distance. Children laughed somewhere behind me. Music drifted through warm afternoon air. And beside me stood Claire Bennett, still capable of making the rest of the world disappear with a single smile. People often assume happiness arrives all at once. It does not. It arrives quietly. In ordinary mornings. Shared coffee. Long conversations. Familiar footsteps coming down a hallway. It arrives in the moments you almost overlook. Claire taught me that. After everything we had been through, neither of us wanted a life built on fear or expectations. We wanted something simpler. Something real. Claire continued teaching art. I invested in community programs throughout the city. My father spent more time laughing than arguing. Somehow, against every prediction, all of us healed. The greatest surprise arrived on a bright October morning. Claire walked into our kitchen holding a small white envelope and a smile she could not hide. I knew immediately that something had changed. What is it? I asked. Her eyes filled with happy tears. Then she handed me the envelope. For several seconds, I simply stared at the paper inside. My hands actually trembled. Claire laughed through her tears. You were supposed to say something. I looked up at her. I think I forgot how words work. 9 months later, our daughter entered the world and instantly became the center of it. Emma Bennett Moretti. Blonde hair. Green eyes. A smile that looked exactly like her mother's. From the very beginning, she carried the same light Claire brought into every room she entered. Watching Claire become a mother changed me in ways I never expected. She filled our home with warmth, patience, and endless love. The kind of love that asked for nothing and somehow gave everything. One Sunday afternoon, years after that first rainy meeting outside the Arts Center, we visited the same river where Claire had once walked away from me. Emma ran ahead across the grass chasing bubbles while Claire stood beside me watching her. The sunset painted gold across the water. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Claire slipped her hand into mine. What are you thinking about? She asked. I watched our daughter laughing beneath the fading sunlight. I watched the woman who had changed my life. Then I smiled. I am thinking about how close I came to losing all of this. Claire rested her head against my shoulder. But you did not. No, I did not. Years earlier, I believed power could solve every problem. I believed control was strength. I believed responsibility mattered more than happiness. Then a woman arguing with a parking meter during a thunderstorm walked into my life and proved me wrong. Love did not make me weaker. It made me braver. It taught me what was worth protecting. As the sun disappeared beyond the river, Emma ran toward us holding a dandelion in her tiny hand. Claire laughed. I laughed. And for the first time in my life, the future did not feel like a burden. It felt like a gift. Because in the end, the city was never mine to rule. The only thing that truly mattered was standing beside the people I loved while life quietly unfolded around us.